When Abraham Lincoln was on his way to Washington to be inaugurated as president of the United States, the threat of civil war was already hanging in the air. Most common question he was asked by anxious citizens as he made that trip to Washington. He stopped over in New York on his way, and his host was Horace Greeley, a senator and newspaper editor. Greeley asked him if he was worried about a civil war. And in his characteristic fashion, Lincoln kind of leaned back in his chair and told a story. He talked about his early years as a circuit-riding lawyer, riding on horseback from one court session to the next. He said that on one occasion, there'd been a lot of rain, and he and his companions were having to cross swollen streams, and they knew that they were going to have to eventually cross Fox River, still ahead of them. And they would often say to one another, if we're having difficulty crossing these streams, imagine what's going to happen when we get to Fox River. Just sort of played on their minds. The darkness fell, and they stopped at a log tavern that rented rooms for travelers. Another guest there was a circuit-riding Methodist preacher. He had ridden that part of the country for decades, knew that part of the country well, all kinds of weather. So they gathered around him and they expressed their concern to him, and they asked him if he would by any chance know the present state of Fox River. The old circuit-riding preacher smiled and he said, "Yeah, I've had to cross Fox River a lot of times, and I understand your worry, but I have one fixed rule in my mind with regard to Fox River. I never cross it till I reach it." It's a wonderful homespun antidote to worry, isn't it? Don't cross Fox River until you reach it. The truth is, God hasn't given any of us the grace, the level of trust, the strength we need to cross that river or any other obstacle that's ahead. We have to wait until we get there. In his book entitled Getting Through the Tough Stuff of Life, Chuck Swindoll commented on the passage we're about to study, and he put it colorfully when he wrote this: "Worry casts shadows on your future. Anxiety works like a thief in the dark corners of your thoughts as it pickpockets your peace and kidnaps your joy." The reality is obvious, and we're going to face it time and time again in life. If whatever you're worried about happens, worry did not prepare you for it. And if it doesn't happen, it has robbed you of joy along the way. And I can tell you that there's always going to be another Fox River just ahead. The question is, how do we handle that uncertainty that can rob our peace? Well, the Lord is about to give us some inspired divine wisdom to address this subject. Let's go back to Luke's Gospel. We're in chapter 12, if you're new to our study. The Lord has just finished delivering a parable in order to make a point, and the parable sets the stage for what the Lord is going to say next, specifically to his disciples. In fact, if you go to verse 21 and circle the word treasure, you can draw a line, as I have, over to verse 34, where the word treasure appears again. These conversations are connected, best understood in their context. If you were with us You may remember it all started back in verse 13 with a young man who was upset about his inheritance. He wasn't getting his due. Evidently, his older brother, who was the executor of the estate, was sitting on his hands. And the younger brother is angry and frustrated. He has plans. It is rightfully his. But Jesus pulls the mask off that frustration and calls it greed. That was shocking. He was legally correct, but he was spiritually incorrect. His heart wasn't right. And then Jesus expands his answer to this young man by telling him in the crowd the story. And it's a parable about a rich man who couldn't squeeze one more possession into his attic, his barn. That just slipped out. That's a little too convicting. Let's move on. So he decided to build a bigger garage. A barn, whatever. Never happened because he died. Now, as we learned in our last study, the Lord isn't against bumper crops, material gain, even a bigger barn. The issue is not what you own. The issue is what owns you. And that's the issue Jesus is uncovering. So he says here in verse 21, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. In other words, if it's all about you, nothing about others, nothing about God, we're no better off than this man here. Now, with that parable, Jesus turns specifically to his disciples and says to them in verse 22, notice, and he said to his disciples, therefore, I tell you, therefore, this is all connected. Do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Now, it's as if Jesus anticipates what his disciples would be thinking. Here, following his command, literally translated, stop worrying. Stop being anxious, because they were. They didn't know what was ahead. And the disciples are probably thinking here, wait a second, Lord, if we don't look after our needs, what we're going to eat, what we have hanging in the closet, we're not going to worry about that, who will? Jesus anticipates that concern and he begins to give them an answer. And as I studied this passage, it easily breaks down into what I'd like to call a three-part antidote to anxiety. And part one is to think correctly. He says here in the opening line, again of verse 24, consider the ravens. You could circle that verb. It's going to be repeated. Consider verse 24. You could draw a line down to verse 27. Consider the lilies. The verb means to think perceptively, to think based upon knowledge. In other words, when you're weighed down by worry, you need to start telling yourself the truth. The same verb was used over in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 1, where the writer tells us to consider Jesus. In other words, think correctly about Jesus. We need to get the truth about Jesus right, according to the scriptures. So to consider here, Jesus is telling them, is to think biblically. It means to think correctly. So what is it that worry messes up in our thinking? Where does worry ambush us and attempt to lead us onto the wrong path? Well, let me break it down, as the Lord does, several different ways. First, worry distorts the preciousness of human life. Go back to verse 24. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Oh, how much more value are you than the birds? The word for raven here, by the way, is a word that includes the entire crow family, which includes the ravens. Ravens were considered the most useless type of birds in the Jewish world. Sparrows were like them, cheap, but they could at least be used, sold for food or temple sacrifices, but not ravens. They were useless. They were considered unclean. They were not kosher. They were unedible. And beyond that, in fact, to this day, for avid bird watchers, they really aren't interesting. There are no patterns of blue or red or yellow. There are no flashes of color. Ravens don't have a pleasant song. They squawk and screech. In fact, my wife and I never like it when they come in and land and the limbs of the trees around us. They're just noisy. It isn't an accident that Jesus specifically mentions this bird. Because of all the birds, if any bird isn't going to be cared for, it's a raven. If any bird's going to fall off God's radar of concern, it would be that useless bird, at least in our thinking. So how would we apply that? Well, if you think that maybe you're not talented enough or eloquent or useful or effective or noticeable, surely God will overlook me. I'd better start worrying about who's going to take care of me. Why would God care about me? No, Jesus says, take a good look at them. They're your antidote to anxiety. If God cares about them, well, think. Think about it. What does that tell you about you? Uniquely created in the image of God, with an eternal soul, with the ability to worship and commune with God, to be indwelt by the Spirit, to have the privilege one day of co-reigning with Christ in his kingdom. Think. Tell yourself the truth. Do you really think God would feed the ravens and forget his disciples? Now, verse 25, which of you, being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? That phrase could be rendered a cubit to his height, an hour to his life. In other words, worry, says that you're going to have to care about your life more than God does. Worry says you're going to have to do everything you can to extend your life 60 minutes because God isn't in control. The truth is, God has your life mapped out from beginning to end. David says in Psalm 39, the Lord knows the measure of my days. Job says in chapter 14 of verse 5, God is determined already how long I will live. Now, Jesus isn't saying, well, then don't take care of yourself. Don't exercise, go to the doctor, Krispy Kreme, whatever. No, he's saying that worrying about the length of your life will not add 1 hour to it. Now, maybe you think that the people of Christ's day would have a lot less to worry about in those days. It was so simple back then. Well, the truth is they had a lot more reasons to worry than we do. The typical worker was paid daily, not weekly or monthly. You got sick that day and didn't go in the next day, you didn't get paid that day. There was no disability. There was no sick leave, no maternity leave. They didn't have Social Security, pensions, welfare. There was no such thing as a benefit package with insurance companies. There was no Medicare, Medicaid, no pharmacies, no urgent care facilities, no penicillin, no aspirin. We could go on about the lack of refrigeration, clean drinking water. They didn't have food stored for days on end. They had every reason to worry about the next meal. They could easily wonder if they're going to survive another day. Worrying for them and for us doesn't add an hour to life. But in the meantime, it steals the joy along the journey. Now, Jesus goes on to give us another illustration from creation, verse 27. He says, consider, think about the lilies, how they grow, they neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these, those purple anemones out there that are going to bloom one day and be gone the next, cannot compare to the royal robes of purple that Solomon wore. So this is what worry is really doing for you. It distorts the preciousness of your life in the hands of your Creator, God. Secondly, worry questions the power of God. Verse 28, but if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little trust, faith? In other words, if God is powerful enough to create this world and the ravens with instinct and the flowers with beauty, and even the grass that's going to be cut and dried and used to fuel the clay ovens of the Lord's generation, if God can do all of that, but he can't take care of you, well, he isn't all powerful then. He's limited, and he can't keep his promise to you. So think about that. Think about what that says about God and your estimation of God's promise. If God is powerful enough to create the world, he's powerful enough to manage the world. If he created, so to speak, Fox River, he's capable of getting you across it when the time comes. See, Jesus is making the point that if God our Father is powerful enough to create your life, don't you think he's powerful enough to direct your life? Just look around. Look at his management of creation. Look, it's delivering this message, and it's loud and clear. If we'll just take a look, even through that squawking raven, God's creative glory is everywhere. I think perhaps we're just in too much of a hurry. We're too worried about stuff that we stop looking around. I was in the truck the other day with one of my grandchildren, strapped into the back seat. It was sunset. I'm in a line on 1010. And I heard a little gasp in the back seat and a voice that said, Papa, look at that sunset. Look at the sky. I hadn't noticed. I wasn't looking at the sky. I was wondering why that guy in front of me was driving so slow. Started praying for him. Unspoken requests. Worry distorts the preciousness of human life. Worry questions the power of God. Now the Lord gives one final danger. We'll put it this way. Worry adopts the perspective of unbelievers. Makes us live like them. Verse 29, and do not seek what you're to eat, what you're to drink, nor be worried, for all the nations of the world seek after these things. And your Father knows that you need them. It's what the world is living like. Your translation may read Gentiles or pagans. They seek after these things. In other words, this is what pagans are chasing after. All they care about is life now, bodies, pleasures, the wardrobe, what we're going to eat, what we're going to do for ourselves. That's as far as they go. Now the verb seek in the text has to do with this mindset. It has to do with instinctive, internal passion. It's a word that relates to determined focus. This is what they have their hearts set on. This is what they're focused on. This passage, as I was studying it on the birds, instinct, mindset, reminded me of instinctive passion and focus God has built into creation. Just this past week, Marcia had just finished putting out some fresh bird seed. I was standing there at the window watching all the different birds arriving to eat. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement on the ground. I looked over and saw a large white cat carefully moving toward that bird feeder. It was a well-fed cat, had a collar. I'd never seen it before, but I watched it glide a little, then pause. And carefully put another paw out and then take another step. Every fiber in its body tensed, ready. It was never for a moment distracted from its mission. It had one thing in mind: murder. Slaughter. I went out, tried to witness to it, wasn't interested. Well, the word here means that kind of focus, that kind of passion, that kind of intention. I'm not going to be distracted. So here's the convicting question. What are we laser beam focused on? What do we want more than anything? Here's the contrast in verse 31. Instead, seek, focus on his kingdom. And these things, the basics of life, will be added to you. In other words, when God matters most, worry takes a back seat. That's what it means to think correctly. The antidote to worry, part of it is thinking correctly. Now, the Lord gets very personal with his close circle of disciples. Notice verse 32 where he says, "Fear not, little flock." I love that. Luke, by the way, is the only gospel writer to include these phrases. This particular phrase is found only here in the entire New Testament, little flock. I got to tell you, I'm glad that Jesus is not wrapping up this correction, by saying, "Fear not, courageous leaders. Fear not, people of deep faith." Now, the Lord calls them defenseless animals who are going to need a shepherd, a divine shepherd. Because there are fox rivers, so to speak, that are fearful, life-threatening, dangerous, difficult. What are we? I love the fact that he even calls them little flock. Today's population, we still are in the minority. We're a little flock. Fear not, verse 32 again, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. The construction indicates he's already given it to them. It's as good as theirs. So it is for you. It's already yours. You're heading there. So part one to this antidote to anxiety is this: think correctly. Now, part two is live generously. Jesus tells them and us here in verse 33, now you can feel free to sell your possessions and give to the needy. So the antidote to worry isn't just thinking correctly, but living generously. Now, hold on. The Lord didn't say here to sell all your possessions and give everything you have to the needy. If you did that, you'd be needy and would need somebody to bail you out. Jesus is giving a contrast to the rich farmer who just wanted more for himself, didn't care about anyone else. And one author writes that what the Lord is saying here is essentially telling them to hold things loosely. Be ready to give away what you really don't need or you have extra to share. It might be to missionaries in another country. It might be a needy family that you hear about. Give some of your time. Join that team of volunteers. Live generously. Think correctly. Finally, let me give you part 3 in this divine antidote, and that is to invest eternally. The Lord says here in verse 33, the middle part, provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old. I love that. With a treasure in the heavens that does not fail. That is, it won't go bankrupt. It'll never empty out. Where no thief approaches, no moth is going to chew away at it. For where your treasure is, there is your heart also. I love the analogy here. Earth's money bags have holes in them. Stuff won't last, won't satisfy. But heaven's money bags, so to speak, have eternal dividends. The results of your investments will last forever. Are you investing in eternal things? People last forever. So invest in ministry to them. God lasts forever. Develop your relationship with Him. The church lasts forever. The gospel lasts forever. Ministry that brings Him glory will bring dividends. Jesus, by the way, people read this and think, oh no, here we go. Jesus is not putting a plug in here for donors. He's not interested in donors. He wants partners. He's looking for investors who have a vision for eternal treasure. When you invest your time and talent and treasure in eternal things, what happens to you in the meantime? Anxiety gets crowded out. There's no room for it to take hold. It no longer calls the shots. It's not gripping the wheel of your life. It's what happens when you begin thinking correctly and living generously and investing eternally. I close with this. A young retailer in the late 1800s started his own business. It wasn't long until his Midwest chain of stores became successful, earning him more and more profit. By 1903, he was a millionaire. His company continued growing. The year before the stock market crashed, the year 1928, his business brought in $184 million. That's in the billions, by the way, in today's economy. Then he lost it all in the crash of 1929. It left him destitute, crushed by the weight of anxiety for his future and his family's. He was broken. He began to lose his grip on sanity. He began to believe that everybody was against him, even his family, friends. In 1931, he was placed there in Michigan in the Battle Creek Sanitarium for the mentally insane. He was convinced he would die within days. He wrote farewell notes to his family and friends. But he didn't die. He was confused in his instability. One night between shifts, even though he was on 24-hour suicide watch, between shifts, he tiptoed downstairs to just roam around, and he heard music. from the hospital chapel. He looked in, and gathered were just a few people, a few staff, who were having a little worship service, singing a hymn. He went in and sat down and listened. The words of that hymn brought to his memory the gospel of his childhood, his parents that he had rejected. He knew the gospel already. He knew that this was God's message to him. He returned to his room, got on his knees, and gave his life to Christ. He would tell people from then on that he had been born again in a sanitarium for the mentally insane. His mental health returned. He was dismissed from the institution. He had a newfound passion for Christ. Even though he was 56 years of age, he decided to re-enter the retail business, and it began to take off once again. And this time, however, as his wealth grew, so did his generosity to charitable causes, especially those connected to the gospel of Christ. He continued leading his company over the next 35 years until he died in 1971 at the age of 95. His name was James Cash Penney. We know him as J.C. Penney. The year he died, his company earned $5 billion. But for J.C. Penney, what mattered most, and I couldn't help but think of him when I looked at this and thought of my own need and yours as well, as he began to think correctly, live generously, and invest eternally. The hymn, by the way, that he heard that night as a patient was inspired by this text in Luke's gospel. It's the antidote to anxiety. I thought it summed it up well. Some of the lyrics read, "Be not dismayed whate'er betides. God will take care of you. Through every day or all the way, God will take care of you. No matter what may be the test, God will take care of you."